Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my review of VCARB, RB, Racing Bulls, whatever name you want to call it. I'm talking about the Faenza team's 2024 F1 season. An interesting season, I think very, very high expectations going into it. Of course, this year they started to use more Red Bull parts, rear suspension, that kind of thing, more aerodynamic pieces as well. So again, there's going to be a lot of superficial similarities to the 2023 Red Bull car. And again, with that came expectation that they would have a pretty good season. I think many, myself included, expected them to be amongst the front runners in the midfield. And while I think they had an okay season, definitely overall a better season in 2023, I do still think that they fell somewhat short of those expectations put on them before the season got started. So first, we're going to talk about the drivers, their drivers, and their driver head-to-head. So again, this is one of two teams where there's basically three drivers total in two different pairs. So we'll, of course, be starting with the first pair, the pair that the team started the season with, and that is Tsunoda and Ricciardo. So for Tsunoda and Ricciardo, they did 18 races together, and then Daniel Ricciardo was, of course, replaced after the 2024 Singapore Grand Prix. Don't know why I added the 2024 there. Of course, it was this year. And then was replaced by Liam Lawson for the last 6 races. But for Tsunoda and Ricciardo, qualifying was definitely not Ricciardo's strength this year. Tsunoda beat him pretty comfortably, 12-6 in the overall quali head-to-head, with a median qualifying gap of 0.179 seconds in Tsunoda's favor, which is a pretty fair margin. It's definitely not nothing. When you look at average starting position, average finishing position, for Tsunoda, 11.67 was his average starting position over those 18 races, and for Ricciardo, 13.11. So about a position and a half difference between them. But when you look at average finishing position, not much difference there. For Tsunoda, 12.13, and for Ricciardo, 12.75. So Ricciardo definitely making up more positions. Over from this starting position to the end of the race, whereas Tsunoda actually lost positions over those 18 races. When you look at some of the race stats, though, it is a bit of an interesting picture. So for Tsunoda, finished 12th in the championship at the end of the season. Ricciardo finished 17th. If he had been able to do the full season, maybe he finishes 1 or 2 positions higher. When you look at race head-to-head, 8-6, so much closer between the two of them. However, the points don't really show that story. For points, 22 for Tsunoda, 12 for Ricciardo. And I think, unfortunately for Ricciardo, one of the most damning statistics for him is my expected points model for him this year. So when you look at points above expected, and this is only for the Grand Prix, so it doesn't include sprint points. For Tsunoda, he was negative 6.12 over the full year, which comes out to 83%. So again, not great, but still it's okay. For Ricciardo, it was a negative 9.42, which comes out to only 43%. So model says that he scored less than half the points that he should have based on how good the car was and based on where he was starting. And I think the reason for that mismatch is because, of course, Ricciardo scored 5 points in the sprint in Miami, only got 12 points the whole year, so that's almost 30 to 40% of his points in a sprint race. And again, shows that he wasn't really scoring that many points in the Grand Prix. And of course, first 7 races, that's kind of where Ricciardo was at his lowest, but it's also where the car was at its best. And conversely, when Ricciardo and Tsunoda were very evenly matched, I would say from Canada onwards, the car was not as good, so not as capable of getting points. The other thing as well is that pivotal Canada race, the big difference there was that Ricciardo got a new chassis. So whether or not the chassis had a massive effect or whether it was a psychological thing, it's one of those things that's hard to really decide unless the team clearly states otherwise. But nonetheless, I do think in the qualifying, Tsunoda was clearly the better of the two. In the races, I think it was pretty close, but I think over the course of the whole time together, this year, I think Tsunoda was slightly better. When you look at average power rankings, again, over the course of the whole season, Sonoda was 11.13, which ranked 10th. So again, in the top half for Sonoda. Thought he had a very good season. And for Ricciardo, 13.56, which ranked 16th. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of drivers who are basically around 12 to 13. And Ricciardo is basically towards the lower end of that. So again, not saying that Ricciardo was absolutely awful, but I definitely don't think he was great. And I definitely don't think he lived up to the pretty high expectations that were put on him going into the season, as many people were talking about him as a successor for Sergio Perez at Red Bull, either mid-season, as almost happened during the summer break, or for 2025. And of course, neither of those things happened. Now, let's see. So, obviously, for Ricciardo, he came back in 2023 from his kind of sabbatical, and then let's see, why is this not working? So let's see, why are we not? Oh, there we go. Okay. He came back from his sabbatical after he was kind of let go by McLaren, and he came back mid-season. He did 2 races, promptly broke his hand, and then came back for the last 5. So there's only 7 races of data between Tsunoda and Ricciardo in 2023. So again, very, very small sample size and a bit skewed as well because of the circumstances. But when you look at the differences in their performances relative to each other, comparing 2023 2024 for the race model, for example, gap actually went down. And I do think that a lot of that is due to a small sample size in 2023. But for qualifying, for example, the gap actually went up. So in qualifying, in their 7 races together, the median difference between them was, I think, 4 thousandths of a second. Very, very small, and they were almost dead even. And that was one of the reasons why I thought, Ricciardo should be able to, step up and, be the better of the 2 drivers over the course of a full season. And unfortunately, that qualifying gap ballooned to almost 0.2 of a second in 2024. So that it's interesting to see why that happened. But I think, again, the poor qualifying performances were, I think, a big part of the reason why Ricciardo was let go after Singapore, and why they decided to bring Lawson in. So now looking at Tsunoda and Lawson, for some reason why is my key not working? That's something to figure out later. But Tsunoda and Lawson, 6 races together. So again, very small sample size, even smaller than Ricciardo and Tsunoda. But qualifying head-to-head now, on a lot of the official statistics, it's 6-0 in favor of Tsunoda. However, based on the way that I calculate the statistics, which is, for example, if a driver doesn't set a time in a given session. So, for example, if a driver doesn't set if one of a set of teammates doesn't set a lap time in Q2, I'll base the qualifying head-to-head based on the Q1 times. So, if, for example, for their first race together in Coda, Lawson set a better time than Tsunoda in Q1, didn't set a lap time in Q2 because of his engine penalty. So again, I gave the qualifying head-to-head to Tsunoda. Again, there was circumstances there that you could also argue in favor of Tsunoda there, but I'm just going to clarify why that's going to be different than a lot of the official statistics. When you look at the median qualifying gap, though, despite the fact that it was 5-1 in favor of Tsunoda, half a tenth of a second between them, and that's very, very small. And it's a big improvement for Lawson over 1 lap compared to 2023, where the median gap was about 0.3 of a second. So again, 6 races, really abbreviated campaign, no testing. Technically, he's never had a full season F1, and over 6 races, being half a tenth off of Tsunoda over 1 lap on a lot of tracks he doesn't know, I think is pretty good. And I think that's a big improvement from last year. And again, was one of the big question marks about his ability after his first 5 races. When you look at average starting position, 9.33 for Tsunoda, 13.17 for Lawson. Again, that small sample size and the grid penalty from the first race, his first race at the US Grand Prix, is definitely going to hurt that. When you look at average finishing position, not as close, 11.00 for Tsunoda, 12.80 for Lawson. So again, a bit of a difference there. And when you look at some of the other stats as well, so for Tsunoda, again, 12th in the championship, like I said before. For Lawson, 21st, 4 points for him and 8 points for Tsunoda over their time as teammates, so a little bit closer than Ricciardo and Tsunoda. And when you look at race head-to-head, 3-1 in favor of Tsunoda. When you look at expected points model, the data for Tsunoda is the same as what I said before, but for Lawson, negative 1.93, so 67%. So still not great, 67%, but again, it is a little bit better than Ricciardo's numbers. For average power ranking as well, 13.00 and ranks 14, so again, a little bit better than Ricciardo, but again, I don't think quite as good as Lawson. And again, a driver who's basically been shipped in mid-season after doing 5 races the year before. So again, very low on F1 experience. I think he did a pretty good job. Again, I understand why, if you're a Tsunoda fan, why you would be somewhat frustrated that Lawson would be seen as kind of the front runner for a Red Bull seat should Red Bull decide to actually replace Perez. Given that, statistically, Tsunoda has been the better driver, and, he's basically beat De Vries pretty handily, beat Ricciardo as well, and again has looked better than Lawson. Why he wouldn't be seen as the front runner for that seat, I can understand why you'd be frustrated by that, but I do think that there's a lot of background politics involved. I haven't really gotten into that. I have my own theories for why Tsunoda is not being kind of seen as the front runner should Perez get replaced, but that's kind of a story for another time. Now, when you compare again, Tsunoda, Lawson, 2023 to 2024. Again, I will put a massive asterisk on this, given that for both campaigns, 2023 and 2024, sample sizes are very, very small. So again, you can't really read too much into this, but I thought just so that we can make this comparison, let's go ahead. So like I kind of alluded to before, with the qualifying, you can see clear improvement, basically 0.3 of a second, 2023. And again, a gap that's about half a tenth. So again, good improvement there by Lawson. But for the race model, it's actually very interesting. So 2023, sample size of 5 races, the race model was about -1. So again, a score of 1 in Lawson's favor. In 2023, of course, he scored 2 points versus Tsunoda's 0 that year. But again, this year, the race model score between the two of them is about 1.5. So big difference there. And again, it shows how under small sample sizes, the numbers can fluctuate so wildly, which is why you have to be very, very careful when analyzing this data, and you have to set pretty high bars for a minimum number of races together. So again, this data is not super useful, but again, it's interesting to see the comparison. I think the qualifying one is probably more indicative of Lawson's progress and kind of the real gap between the two of them, because qualifying there generally tends to be a lot less noise, a lot less kind of chaos involved, and it's a bit more representative of the pace gap between the two drivers. All right, now taking a look at RB and looking at some of their stats from this year. So for points, they ranked eighth in the Constructors' Championship, 46 points. And I think, of course, with Alpine basically leapfrogging both Haas and them the last 4 or 5 races, basically from Brazil onwards, despite the fact that over the course of the season, they were definitely the weaker car. Again, I think it's a bit, I think there was definitely a source of frustration there, both for RB and for Haas. But when you look at average pole gap, for example, 1.019, which ranks 7th, so a little bit behind Haas. And when you look at average minimum finishing position, which I think is a good indicator of looking at a team's performance on race day, 10.25, which ranks 8th. So actually does end up behind Alpine. I think it took until that final race in Abu Dhabi for the order between the two to actually flip around. But nonetheless, I think it definitely shows. I think RB was pretty good in qualifying. They were better, clearly better than Alpine, and just a smidgen off of Haas. But again, in the race, I think they did fall back a little bit, especially compared to the Haas. Now, when we look at pole gap and looking at the pole gap over the course of the season, at the start of the year, so RB, I'll get my cursor over there, see if we can actually get that on screen. So our RB is basically the dark blue line here, and at the start of the season, they were basically a second off pole, which again is pretty decent. Again, after that first race, which you can see where Haas were a little bit better than them, they were basically kind of class of the midfield, of course, excluding Aston Martin at this point. As you can see, there's a big gap to the other teams back here. And again, they even got to a point where basically around Monaco, Canada, they had a 3-race rolling average of pole gap of about half a second, which is very, very good, especially for those, midfield teams. But then after that, you can basically see they basically just kind of went backwards and ended up kind of falling backwards into the clutches of the rest of the midfield teams, where there's not really a whole lot to separate, them from Haas, from Williams, from Alpine as well at that point. But again, towards the end of the season, they did get a little bit better, and they ended up back basically where they started, where they're about second off pole on average, where again, they were basically clear of, your Astons, your Williams, and your Saubers, but again, behind both Alpine and Haas to end the year. So basically ended the season, started the season at the same spot. And again, I think, for just looking at pole gap, I think they'll be somewhat satisfied with that result. Now, when you break their season down into quarters for the race results, you can see that for the average finishing position. So again, this isn't the minimum finishing position, but when you look at average finishing position and you look at, I've basically inverted the axis. So up is faster and down is slower, basically. They basically are a flat line at like 12 for the first 2 quarters of the season. They drop and then they go back up to around 12 to end the year. But when you look at their points, they started with the first quarter, they had about 20 points, most of those being Tsunoda's, and there's basically a gradual drop off through the first 3 quarters, where they basically go down to a handful of points that third quarter of the season, where again you could see that drop off for average finishing position. But they do again rebound a bit in that final quarter, scoring a decent haul of points. Again, a lot of that's going to be Brazil, but again, it does kind of line up with where their finishing position was. Now, final graph I want to show for RB is looking at the team over the last 5 years and looking at kind of their performance over those 5 years and seeing kind of like what kind of trend they've been on. So 2020, 21, generally very, very good cars. You can see in its average starting position, a big improvement 2020 to 2021, where they were, almost on the cusp of being like a very slow front running team in qualifying. Again, not there in the race, but in qualifying, they were very, very good in 2021, as Gasly showed with all those qualifying sessions where he qualified 4th. But unfortunately, new regulations were not very kind to them. You can see massive drop-off in performance 2022 in both race and qualifying. Again, a further drop-off in the following year in 2023. Again, how much of that is them losing Gasly and substituting him with a combination of De Vries, Ricciardo, and Lawson for the season? It's hard to tell, but they've definitely, improved quite a bit, especially in qualifying performance. So you can see the blue line, big improvement from 2023 to 2024 this year. In the races, a small improvement, not a big improvement. And again, it's something that they're going to want to work on for 2025. As for their driver lineup for next year, we still don't know. It could be Tsunoda and Lawson. It could be Tsunoda and Hadjar. It could be Lawson and Hadjar. It could be Perez and Lawson. It could be Perez and Tsunoda. We don't really know. So again, it's hard to really give a kind of projection of what kind of performance they'll be able to get next year from their drivers, given that we don't really know who their drivers are going to be, and that's something that hopefully should be clarified in the coming weeks. I think if we get to a point where Red Bull announce who the second RB driver is going to be alongside Tsunoda, officially Tsunoda, in 2025, then I think that will be a pretty safe sign to say that Perez will be sticking around at Red Bull in 2025. But the fact is, they haven't announced who Tsunoda's teammate is going to be yet, which to me tells me that there's still negotiations ongoing and it's still kind of a fluid situation. So there you go. There's my review of RB's 2024 F1 season. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with my review of Haas. So again, thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.